Hello, my great pleasure to see you all. My name is Snezhana. I'm one of the curators of Garage, and I had the pleasure and honor to work with Katharina Grosse. I hope you have all seen it. Today, Katharina has prepared a wonderful lecture. It will last for about 40 minutes. After that, you can ask your questions. Let me give the floor to Katharina right now, because her words are more interesting than mine.
Thank you so much for whatever you said. I have no clue. And thanks for having me tonight. And I'd like to talk a little bit about my work, which I'm very happy to have had the chance to doing here and developing in here furthermore. And I thought about talking a little bit how I started these thoughts on doing the practice that I have, which is basically I work in the studio, I work on canvases and on all sorts of surfaces that you can move and be mobile with in painting, but I also have a large practice that deals with me painting in the space that I'm given. And it's quite a hybrid field that I work in. I believe a painting can appear anywhere. A painting has no fixed location, but it has a very interesting report to architectural and also sculptural space. Some visitors coming from outer space maybe also. Okay, so I wanted to go back a little bit to things that were early on stuck in my mind and that kept my practice infused with information. One of them was that I was very, very fascinated by an artist who lived in Norway. Just a second, sorry. Which is, here we see him working outside. It's Edvard Munk. Edvard Munk was using interesting spaces to do his work in. It wasn't an enclosed studio space, but he used to work. Well, how is that? Oh, good. So maybe they're going to change me after a while, who knows? So Edvard Munk was really believing that a painting doesn't only come about in the studio itself, but it is also being made by the way it's treated. So by the way that it is being painted outside or also being put into the snow. He left his paintings in the snow, he left them unkept, he took them off the stretchers, he had them hung up on a hook. Here we see the painting The Sun that he actually painted for the law school in Oslo, and later on it did get stretched, but his free, open and very fearless report towards his work I was very influenced by. And I went to Norway as a young painter, and I went to see where he lived and how he worked and where his paintings were shown. And another big influence in my life was early on, since I was a little child, was theater. So hence that a very strong theatricality in my installational work. So my parents used to take me early on to see dance theater, to see classical theater. Here we see Pina Bausch's dance company that was just next to where I grew up. And what took me to her practice was also the way that she linked a traditional, let's say, medium like ballet dancing and kind of infused everyday movements into it. So the sheer thrust of running over the stage or of throwing stuff around, of moving everyday activities into dance actions and into choreographical, even manneristic movements. That was very fascinating to me and has kept a big influence on my work. And so I had the feeling that a painting should not only be behaving well on a wall, but should kind of expand. And then what can I do as a painter with that kind of knowledge of the everyday issues that I have in my life and in my understanding of my surroundings? And so I started to take up invitations to make paintings with very simple movements. I had a moment in my work where I sat down and said, okay, what is the basic, with all the different things that I did at that time, what is the basic ingredient of my work, of all those different areas that I have? And I realized it's actually color. So I tossed all the other issues out of the window, and I started to kind of, with very simple activities, to move color up and down and from left to right, and I was trying to understand how those different fields then get in touch with the space and with the people that work in the space. So here we see a little restaurant for people that would be trained as electricians in Siemens, in the mother plant of Siemens in Munich. And after a little while, as the paintings got bigger and bigger on the wall, I thought it was kind of weird that painting, or that my painting would stop at the ceiling or stop at the end of the wall. And I was thinking it is too close to the idea of the three-dimensional space. And I thought that as a painter, actually, painting behaves differently in space, because the spatial idea of painting isn't three-dimensional, it's multi-dimensional. As we can't measure the pictorial space with a tape measure, we can't say it is 30 centimeters deep if I use a certain blue. So I had a chance all of a sudden in 99 or 98, I think it was, in Bern, in the Kunsthalle, to do a painting or to do something that was whatever I liked. So the curator said, you have carte blanche, you can do whatever you like. And I was at a moment in my life where I thought the painting should really appear on a different location in the space. So I started to use a spray gun to be independent from the space and the spatial surfaces. And I sprayed one color, a very dark green, onto the ceiling and the wall and the two walls. And I liked that one color. It was a very dark green, but the very dark green can have different nuances, so it can turn really black, it can be like a bottle green, it can be very transparent. So I thought it was actually multicolored in a way. It wasn't monochrome. And I also prepared this painting really carefully. I made a little model. I was very closely to the model when I was painting this piece, and that started to get on my nerves. I was thinking, why do I actually copy an idea I had beforehand? So I started to say, okay, I come with all the colors I have, I go into the space, and then I decide right in the space how I was going to expand the painted surface. Here we see like a very interesting space that I don't know whether it still exists in London, a little later than I did the green painting. So you came into the room, I don't know, can you see the green dot? Or do I? So you came in here, and as you would enter the room, you would not see all that stuff here. So you would have all of a sudden a situation where the painting wouldn't be opened up to you in a one kind of point of view. You had to kind of drift through to understand what you can see and what you can't see. And also we had very different surfaces in that building. There was corrugated iron, there was drywall, there was real wall, there was, so I started to see that this isn't a wall painting anymore, but it's a painting in the inside of a body. So I thought it's actually more like a relationship of the painted surface to a body rather than the painted surface to a wall, which made me understand far more the relationship of the painting and the building rather than the painting and just a certain moment within the concept of an architectural situation. Here we see one of the early works as well. It's in Marfa, Texas, in the Gennady Foundation, where I had a studio for a little while, and also I was able to paint indoors in the former shop. It was a meat shop. And when I went home, I would just switch off the light and go home. I wouldn't see the painting like this until somebody took me out for a beer and he said, hey, look, your studio looks really good with the light on. So that's the first time that I started to consider the outside of the building with the painting inside as a totally new kind of relationship and net. And the experience that a painting is always part of a larger component of images started to be very influential on how I was developing my work. And after a lot of different wall paintings and experiments on size and expansion and shrinking the work, I started to be a little unhappy with somehow my work, the deadline business, the working in the space, and I was longing for something more intimate, and I decided to paint over my office. And then I thought that it was maybe too destructive, and I had at that time 2 different apartments, one in Berlin and one in Düsseldorf, and I decided to paint over the sleeping room of my Düsseldorf apartment the way I had left it. And that's what I did. So I wanted to see whether maybe the structure of the room with all the given items like the bed, the boxes you see there that were still from moving, here unpacked with clothes and so on. Then there are books on the bed, there's the duvet, there's the floor, and on the right-hand side, you can't see it on this image, there was a little writing desk. And these were all new things to come into the work, because beforehand my relationship was strictly with architecture and the different surfaces of the buildings. So in this case, I wanted to test whether putting into my practice a bed, which is a very emotionally loaded narrative structure, whether that would actually change the way that the painting would be operating. And that did. I kept this piece for a year in my apartment. I bought another bed next to it and slept in a white bed next to the colored bed, and I showed the painting only, or the work only, to 3 people, which was also a very new experience for me. There was no institutional or curatorial dialogue with somebody else. I just did it for myself to find out what it would do to the work. And I started from then on to implement other things into my work. And the other thing that I also realized for the first time really very clearly is that the painting does something to the surface that actually is breaking up the objecthood of the object. So the painting can, or the colors can, break down the relationship. The bed starts here, the wall starts here, so it goes over the bed and it actually redefines, like the yellow goes over the bed, the pillow, the floor. So it actually has a totally different way of reorganizing the identities and the units of the structure. And that I started to implement then into my works later on. For example, here is a work that followed out of that little bedroom piece just a couple of months later. I put into that piece a huge bookshelf that I filled with books. And I brought also 2 very large paintings from my studio, which were 3 by 6 meters large. I will show them here. This one here and that one over here. And I painted it all over. I also painted the floor over and kind of generated 2 very different structures. The one was the structure with the items that were normally linked to your idea of furnishing a room with books and reading and the idea of knowledge that comes from that kind of information unit, and also the paintings that might be beautifying objects. And then I generated a totally different layer that had its that was overriding the given input. So in a sense, there are 2 structures that are being put together. One is very contrary to the painted image, which is the materialized organization of items of our life, and the other one is an unfathomable pictorial space that is not at all being built according to the same rules that architecture is being put together or objects are being materialized. So these 2 things exist at the same time, which I started to understand as an enormous paradox, so that you actually have an experience of hot and cold at the same time. So 3D organization in material and multi-D thinking in painting at the same time, which are things that normally exclude one another, but you can see them here at the same time. Here you see another detail of the bookshelf. It was a show in Denmark, and I used an iconic Danish bookshelf that you actually grow up with. You get like little units when you're 3-4 years old, and you collect them, then you maybe marry and your partner has the same shelf and you put it together, and all of a sudden you have kind of the idea of the perfect household, which I seem to kind of turn into something else here. Here you see one of the paintings that I took from the studio, and sometimes these paintings get used again in other installations so that they pick up other painting structures from other contexts, or sometimes I just show them taken out of it in a different show. So I do think that a painting is not a structure that is coherent and turned into itself, but I think that a painting is a small snippet of a far bigger context that kind of is invisible. That's been then a thought that infused my canvas painting in the studio for a long time, that you actually can't make perfectly organized structures anymore. I don't believe that. That's not how I see the world. And I also started to use the paintings and the items that I had in my shows in a more mobile way. So this is the first time I used soil. So I put in, besides the bed, which is a very archaic image, or besides the bookshelf, the book, I used the soil as something that is a more infinite material that you can't count. And I actually only put the soil on the floor so as to pop up the painting. So the first thing I did in this installation was put the soil in. Then I used a painting that came from the studio that was already finished, which is this thing here was here at the beginning. Then I totally painted it over. Then I took the painting and popped it up here. It's 8 meters high and 4 meters wide. And the negative space that is now the leftover of a new definition of zero space, I put a new little painting in there with 2 large dot-like structures. So I started to use very much experiences of scale shift to have a very psychological impact on my work, where you experience sometimes the forms as large or as small according to where you are in the installation or what kind of point of view you tend to choose yourself. So there's no one right way to look at the work, but it really depends on your drift and your kind of confrontation with it. Yeah, I put this photo in because it actually came from a friend who is dealing with parapsychological phenomena, and we both were in the same lecture and about unfinished systems, which dealt with the idea, when is something finished, when isn't it finished, how do we actually put our thoughts together. And he said, it's so funny because when I saw your work, it's totally what I deal with in my field, because he gets sent all these photographs from people that think it spooks, there's spook in their house. You know the word, I mean, there are ghosts in the house. So they sent him these pictures and say, look, I went out shopping, I came back, and then the bookshelf was down. So how did this work? And he is a specialist on ghosts. And he said one of the conditions that ghost or spooking can happen in your house is that the people that live there are people that have a certain ability to attract energy. And the energy is so focused, there is a certain neural connection in your brain that's called the D605. And the D605 is the one where the energy is highest and where you kind of recognize a pattern. And all these people that have this are very extroverted people. They are a kind of focus people, and they have the ability to kind of let these things happen around them. And he was thinking, maybe you are like a ghost, he said, actually. Maybe you are not really making the work, but you are the person that just attracts the accident that then causes your installations, which I thought was a really interesting thought, and I stepped away from thinking that I was in the hierarchy of my work methods external. I started to think that I'm internal, which is like I'm on the same level with paint, color, time, the team, the surfaces, and the given situation, which creates a totally different way to work. And then starting from there, I incorporated more and also larger items. And one of the biggest installations I've done so far with soil was in Masmoka in New York, close to about 2 hours away from New York, in an old factory that was producing boxes. And it's one of the first museums that was put into, or one of the first industrial structures that was put to be a museum and an exhibition hall. Very interesting place. And it has this big space with like a 2-story white inside that looks even as if it is a little bit like a facade of an outside building. So I had this feeling it's like inside, outside at the same time. And the light is enormous in that building. There is so much light coming through the windows that I decided to use white, large styrofoam cutouts, which you see here leaning against the big pile of soil, and I will show you how it worked. It was a little more like, the whole show had a lot of different elements. You would walk into the show from here, then you would run into this, walk around, could sit on a bench, and there was also like a warped piece which didn't look like a painting on a wall but had very similar aspects. Then you would walk against another big pile that would kind of wipe out the color here, and as you turn around you would see the large soil pile, and also from top you could walk on top of it and then see where you came from. So it was actually like really walking through different particles and items of a painted and pictorial space. And I just mentioned there was this warped little form in this show, and this started to get me thinking maybe I want to know more about how a painting is showing you just a little glimpse of a world that is like a slot or like a slit into another, like a slither into what we would call normally reality. And I made this really, I started to use more warped mathematical forms that would stand within, in a very different spatial manner, stand within the build situation that I was invited into. So here is a show in a very interesting museum in Wolfsburg in Germany, and all the other artists had mostly, booths where they had their work being shown in more or less a very appropriate but also more like conventional manner, and I managed to make a piece that kind of incorporates all that stuff around it as part, and then yet at the same time have this huge form which was about 18 meters high as like a slot or like a little peek into some other world that is not linguistic or lingual, that is not naming things or describing narrative relationships. And that got expanded, so I made another outdoor thing that had about the same quality as if it was like a broken off piece of something else, of another context that was just slid into the given situation of a very, of a piece of architecture which is a museum in Bonn, which is more or less a very much modernist work coming from modular thinking, and I put this very organic broken off structure leaning against the wall. This painting was also you could see it from above and pass it by, maybe just see it in the angle of your eye, maybe not even realize that you would see it right away, and it also was painted underneath. So there were different spatial relationships. There was an outside relationship and an inside relationship of just this very thin surface that carves into the volume between the two buildings here. At that time, I was really fencing the idea that the painting doesn't sit on masses or on a wall, but it kind of hovers through the volume of the space, that it can sit somewhere in the air, I was thinking. That would be wonderful. This is about from the same time. These are actually the prototypes for this first sculpture I just showed you. I made 4 of these very large ellipses, trying to understand whether the space between them that you see here kind of organizes itself with the missing parts of the painting. So the things that are visible and invisible, they are kind of the same structure to us. So something that you don't see right now, you see maybe later on in another situation. It's very much to what brought me to doing this thing here at the garage piece, where you can be on top of the piece, but you can also under the piece. So when you're under the tent, in a sense, you can't see what you've just seen, and vice versa. So I'm very intrigued by this kind of, the ability of inversion of a given structure. These things then also I took outside sometimes. So this one I just swiveled around, and we got it leaning against a structure out in an older 30s building in Düsseldorf. Or here we see another of these ellipses just popped against a church, where the painting actually meets another image, which is the church, of course, and the window of the church within the city, the urbanity of the city. And also, as you can imagine, as you see here, they encounter such different conditions like weather, light, ever-changing. There is no ever static way to look and evaluate a work, but it always changes in its purpose and also in its trigger function according to how you meet it and how it is being met by the outside. So I really think that the influences that our surroundings have on us, they are so much deeper and maybe also so much more, so much stronger than we tend to believe. Yeah, the outdoor work got expanded by something that I want to show you here that I did for the Public Art Fund in New York. This is a little garden as a courtyard of a university in Brooklyn, Metro Tech. They were one of the first people to invent or to work on 3D printers. And I was invented to do something for this area, and I made 18 large pieces that sometimes had holes, cutouts, that would just be piled up in between the trees. So the trees became like an integral part of the whole thought of how the thing would appear, not only the trees, but also the lampposts, the leaves of the seasons. It was staying up for a whole year. It was also under wonderful conditions of sunlight, and trash bins, benches, all sorts of things were part of the work. People would pass through on their way to the subway station. It would also encounter snow. It would disappear under the snow. It would be like only partially visible. There was also very harsh ice and crushed, condensed snow. So it had all sorts of rough city life to go through. And this, furthermore, made me think maybe the work could be more ephemeral, and I started to be working on a project for a long time that then in the end got executed 2 years ago. It was called Cyclists Row and happened in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia has a very interesting and super prolific tradition of wall painting. So they have a foundation that's called the Mural Arts Fund, and they make wall paintings that are mostly narrative and figurative. They talk about the social situations in neighborhoods. They are addressing focus points of social friction. They are mostly in very poor boroughs, and they're mostly done out of the society of folkloristic activity, of folkloristic painting. And they had a birthday to celebrate, and they thought maybe they invite somebody who is not depicting people, who is not talking about the social structure of the city, and who is maybe not coming from the United States, and who is maybe coming from the art world and not from the graffiti world. So they invited me, and we were having a really hard time to find a good place where I could work. And after a little while, they thought maybe those 5 miles that you take the train from the main station out of the city to New York. These 5 miles, the train is relatively slow, and we could maybe find 7 places where you paint, and I decided to do it. So it's a very ephemeral painting. It was only up for as long as the weather would allow it to stay. I painted here like a long stretch of 400 meters with white and magenta. Here you see it in the progress a little bit. It was mostly plants, rubble, stones, soil, something that would also still start to grow. It was just early spring. And this is how you saw it. So you would pass it by and could only see it from the train. And you could only see it within a very short amount of time. So the kind of encounter of the piece from that side and you from this side was so small that you kind of had the feeling it's not only that the work is just there for a second, but you also thought you were only there for a second, which was something that I didn't think of, that it would happen like this. But that was really interesting, that you had this existential weird feeling of, just now, at this moment, I'm like this. And the next moment, the pink was gone, and then you were had a different experience of yourself. So it was actually like putting a lot of different points of your life together. We had also orange parts. This was the biggest orange, biggest piece of trees being painted as well in front of, just before a bridge. So we had very simple sites. We chose plants, rubble, a bridge, a storage, a hut, and a big wall. So these were the different sites that we chose. And here you have part of the green hut, where you just would see maybe the green and the stone, maybe not the hut, as you pass by according to which train you chose. Or sometimes it was really fast, you would not really see it so clearly. Some of the pieces could also be seen from a bridge or from the streets nearby, so it wasn't only the train that would give you access to the work. Or according to the vegetation in front of it, you would only see parts of the work, of course. So the urban context is a very, very interesting and difficult context to deal with for a painter that has to deal with scale and size. And now I'm coming to a little extra thought, which has to do with the fact that most of these works disappear. So like this thing in Philadelphia, as I said, is only there for like 30 days, or some only like a week, or some only a day, according to what the surface was. And I was invited at that time by a friend to participate in a show which had to do with work in situ, with exactly that installational work that disappears, or where the installational, or where the institution becomes your studio. And I was wondering, where does my work exist? I mean, I can't really do a retrospective with that kind of work because it's all gone. Half of it is only exists in photographs or videos or people talking or writing about it. But then I thought maybe I don't make a work for that show like I normally do, but I use the photograph of my first spray painting and I print it on silk in more or less the original size. And then I hang that silk curtain in front of a wall that is very similar to, that happened to be similar to that first. See, so this is the installation of the silk image. And the silk image is only like 10 centimeters away from the wall. So it actually covers the wall where it would have been sitting in the first version. It covers the wall where it covers its own kind of surface. So the image is also soft. It's not a sharp photographic image in that sense, but it's printed on silk, and the silk has its own way of defining the space. It makes the space unclear. So you do see something that maybe somebody else has seen, photographed, but you see it in a version that is unsharp and also not on a wall, but like an after image. And when I did this, I realized that the silk that is actually coming to the floor and making all these folds, that this kind of space, the folded space, is giving me a whole new way of understanding how the relationship of painting to a surface is. Because if you look at a painting, and a painting has a lot of different layers of color, if you take all these different layers of color apart, you end up with a huge surface that you actually shrink onto a painted space. So painting is very much an activity of making clusters, of making very compressed information clusters that do not have like the beginning and end that a book has, or that music has, or that language has in its consecutional structure. But painting is more or less a medium to put things together without the time frame of logic consequence. And therefore I started to be more interested in the fold and in the folded away space, and I used that idea right away in a show in Graz, in a very interesting building that did have only a flat floor, but the roof was warped. So there was, as a given already, a space that had an enormous bend and flux. And therefore, we made experiments and used foam, folded the foam. So there was a 800 square meter surface, and we put a 2,000 square meter foam mat into that surface, folded it up, and after its folding, I painted it. So the painting on top which is already like a layering of many, many surfaces. On top, a folded surface was starting to give me new friction and in spatial, how would I say, enigma. So some of the painting is on the floor and very precise and has a very clear definition, and some of the painting is on the foam and sinking into that foam, into the space of the material, and kind of creating a totally different structure. So I have a couple of more shots. It would look different from every angle as you walked through it, as you walked around it, and would be very difficult to decipher how it was put together. And now I'm coming to a show that actually led to something that you see here in Garage. It was the format that came up with where I started to have the folding, and then I thought maybe I can have a whole piece of cloth, of fabric, stretched into a space. And the first time I did it in a show last September, in a big show in Düsseldorf, where I showed big paintings in the one part of the show, and another big room as big as the garage room, where I put soil and rubble and big pieces of sculpted clay on top of the fabric. So the space was totally changed by my interference, and at the same time the given situation, the columns would pierce through and affect my work likewise. So there was a certain kind of interference of the two worlds, mine coming into the space. And people were allowed to walk on it. So these are photographs of the early start, and after like 2 months, the whole thing was totally trodden down. There was nearly no color left. It was all just dust and structure. I don't have pictures of those last days, unfortunately, but it was even as if the painting had totally disappeared. And also my work made the ceiling so much more prominent, as you can see here. So the ceiling had a lot of the notion of a facade that was just flicked down. So you had a very unclear orientation in that space. And since the whole space was clad in that fabric, there was also a very muffled sound. So you were, after a little while, you were totally encompassed by this kind of very special acoustic situation. And that led me to another very small, compressed version of it with different items, which maybe some of you might have seen it. So these are the big canvases of the other room. So you could go into that room on the one hand side, and you would walk over a little corridor and come into that space on the other. I just go through this really fast to give you a small glimpse of my canvas work. And I don't want to go into this now because it's too little time to do that. But the work from Düsseldorf, the first fabric work, went into Venice. And Venice the Arsenale has this really old structure with the big columns, which is listed, so I couldn't paint on it. And I was thinking of showing more of the space in this case than I did in that other museum. So you can see here that I left the floor a little open. I showed some of the wall space. I showed the columns, which have a totally different, very, very strong impact on the work. And also I have here, as opposed to my first show with cloth and soil, I have here like a path that's just wood. So you have all sorts of different surfaces where the definition of the work and where the paint behaves so differently and creates such a different relationship with the given surface. So here as you can see, it runs and trickles into the fabric, goes over the folds, and has a totally different way than being so sharp and clear on this path that you would walk through. And then I also incorporated little aluminum casts, which were metal sculptures that I made for that show. So it was a more complex and precise understanding, since the space was smaller. Here you see also an aluminum cast that's kind of camouflaged by the painting in the way that's sitting in those folds. So this metal thing actually held the fold down and gave the whole thing its definition in its space. You see another aluminum cast over here. Oh, sorry, that was not intended. Like here. sometimes nearly invisible. They would sit on the soil or even stick in the soil as something very sharp, edges very sharp and very difficult to tell where it came from. Also, that installation would change a little bit through the way that people would walk through. So the floor got trodden on, you know. There were a lot of changes happening throughout the last weeks since the opening of the Biennale. Also, I had to deal in this space with the elevator. The elevator was in there already. That's an old structure from the times when it was still used to produce particles of ship technology. And here's a stairwell under the cloth. So the cloth also helped me to tackle the space and confront it with a very different feel of painting. Yeah, and this is just the last picture of a canvas painting that I just did when I came home from Venice. It's 4 by 4 meters, and you see a little bit how the kind of perforation of space and pictorial depth also helps me to do what I'm doing in the studio. So there's a very, very strong link between what I'm doing in the studio and what I'm doing alongside in institutional work. And as you have seen maybe here in the garage, that was the first time that I could actually separate the different layers. So I had soil, I had the fabric, and I had the painting as those different ingredients that come together. And in this case, I could kind of make you go under the work and above the work. So I could have actually experiences from earlier pieces with those warped surfaces, for example. I could have them here in a much more open and free way and in a very organic space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really great. And as I understood, there is always a connection between space and color. So I was wondering, why did you use a tree with all its naked roots here at the garage?
Yeah, that is some of the... I have done a couple of tree things before. I used only the trees before. And I was very interested in this iconic strength of that material. Like I had the bed, the soil, you know, the column and the tree. And I like about the tree, it's the theatrical, there are coming a lot of things together in the tree. When it's unrooted, it has lost its location. And I think that the form of the tree, like it's also a tree where the bark is taken off, so it's already manipulated. So you have the long stem that is actually wood, that's material that can be used for any other thing, but the unrootedness, the roots, they still resonate so many different fields that have to do with how you, that draw your body into the understanding of the work. So for example, this kind of the force that's necessary to take that tree out of the soil, that I think is very strongly in that in the tree lying there, and also that it could be a paintbrush, you know, in a certain sense. So is the tree actually somehow incorporated in making the work in a certain sense, because it's also painted and the roots are painted. So I think that's an interesting, container of information, for example. It also could be that it has to do with your understanding of filigrane, smallest structures all of a sudden that you have in that situation. But also there's a very strong emotional container as well, like destroying the life of something that's grown maybe 80 years. So there are many reasons for that. And also it refers to, one last thing, to the idea of painted sculpture or painted wooden sculpture, and the idea that paint or color camouflages the so-called authentic value of a material, which very clearly shows that I'm not dealing with sculpture as a sculptor, but I'm very much interested in the idea of the ambiguity of the surface as a painter.
Katharina, I'm going to abuse the fact that we already had many conversations, and I was wondering, once you told me that you're very interested in painting as a pre-linguistic space. Could you expand a little bit on
Sorry,
that?
what kind of space?
Pre-linguistic space.
Oh yeah. That, I mean, that's one thing maybe that draws all the different areas together. Where I mean, I've been trying to say that I have these hybrid practices in installational works, but also the studio work. But what it all kind of, where my whole interest maybe is kind of rooted and knotted together, is the fact that I'm working in an area that is not using photographic imagery, no language, no a very clear narrative structure, where I'm very interested in the pre-lingual, in the thinking that has to do with that is kind of not following the logic of language thinking. So that is my area of research, let's say, or pleasure, for whatever reason. It's very serious talk. Yeah.
Thank you very much. When you were at Biennale, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear the translator? Good. When we saw your installation at Biennale, it was just imprinted in our memory. So it was very interesting to listen to your lecture. And I have a very serious question now. To what extent does the theme of your work, is the theme of your work related to the theme of the Biennale itself? I thought that the topic of the theme of soil, the earth, is much deeper and much wider, and your installation is much deeper and better than the theme of Biennale itself. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the Biennale is dealing with so many layers of discussion that I think that Okwe Enwesor is trying to pull together. But our talks about the work came from the idea that there is a bifold meaning to the garden, which is on the one hand, I mean, it's an area very clearly that is separated from the outside with a fence or a wall or whatever it is, but at the same time it incarcerates the people that are inside. So this idea of actually putting yourself or differentiating yourself from the other was one of the themes, and I think that my work maybe contributes to that thinking in a way that that I kind of invert all these structures, like the pictorial space hits the materialized and changes it, but at the same time suffers from, or in a sense, you know, gets cut through by the materialized space, but also the idea that you can't, when you walk through this installation, can't say where you are. And maybe you can't even, you have a chance of losing your identity, not in a sense that's unproductive, but maybe in a way that you kind of transgress or transcend a certain existential need. And I think that's maybe also one of the thoughts we had, and also the idea that the hierarchies constantly shift, because you don't have one point from where the whole thing makes sense. So this idea of constantly changing the structure according to the next moment of your needs is something that's intrinsic to my work.
My question is, you have wonderful color and composition solutions. Do you have any special love for paint? Maybe you love especially acrylic paint. Is there any special brand of the paint that you use, or you have no preferences about it?
No, I have a very clear preference. It's called golden acrylics, and it's made in New Jersey in the United States, and I think it's the best acrylic. If you do a normal acrylic, the thing that I'm doing, it will turn very gray after a little while. You need a very poor pigment to do that kind of overlayering.
Спасибо.